What if the greatest leaders in history were remembered not only for their victories, but also for their mistakes? Every U.S. president has carried the weight of impossible choices, and with those choices came errors that shaped the nation. Some are small stumbles. Others changed history forever. In this video, we're going to uncover the biggest mistake of every U.S. president, from George Washington all the way to today. And here's the reward. Stay with me until the very end, because the final section will reveal how these mistakes connect to the leaders we have now and what they teach us about the future. History isn't just about triumph. It's about learning from failure too. What if I told you that even the most admired founding fathers made decisions that almost broke the young United States? We often imagine them as flawless visionaries, but the truth is their biggest mistakes carried lessons that still echo today. Let's look at the first four presidents and the errors that shaped their legacy. George Washington is remembered as the father of the nation, the man who set the example for all leaders to come. But his biggest mistake wasn't about war or foreign policy. It was his deep trust that Americans would avoid political parties. In his famous farewell address, Washington warned that parties would divide the country and weaken democracy. Yet during his own presidency, he leaned heavily toward Federalists, while critics gathered into the Democratic-Republican camp. By not managing the split, Washington saw his dream of unity fall apart right in front of him. His mistake wasn't a single decision, but a failure to realize how strong the hunger for political rivalry would become. And from that moment on, division became part of America's DNA. John Adams, the second president, faced enormous pressure as the nation tried to find its voice in a dangerous world. His biggest mistake was the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Imagine this: a president signing laws that made it harder for immigrants to become citizens, while also punishing anyone who criticized the government. It might have seemed like a way to protect America from foreign threats, but in reality, it attacked free speech and free press, the very rights the revolution was fought for. These laws outraged the public, cost Adams his popularity, and stained his reputation as a champion of liberty. Instead of uniting the country, the acts made Americans fear their own government. Then came Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence and the man who doubled the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. Yet, even Jefferson stumbled. His greatest error was the Embargo Act of 1807. Picture this. Jefferson wanted to keep America out of European wars, so he cut off trade with Britain and France entirely. He thought it would force them to respect American neutrality. Instead, it crushed the U.S. economy. Farmers couldn't sell crops abroad. Merchants lost fortunes. Smugglers filled the gap, and the government lost trust. What Jefferson hoped would be a clever strategy turned into a disaster at home, leaving him with a wounded legacy. Finally, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, carried the country into the War of 1812. His mistake was simple, yet massive. He underestimated British power. Madison believed that America could easily defend itself and maybe even gain territory in Canada. But the war exposed the nation's weak military and fragile economy. Washington, D.C. was invaded. The White House burned. The U.S. barely survived. While the war ended in a sort of draw, Madison's gamble nearly destroyed the young republic. These early leaders built a foundation for democracy, but their mistakes remind us that even visionaries misjudge, overreach, or ignore reality. Their errors weren't just stumbles, they were turning points. And as we move forward through history, each president's biggest mistake shows us not only what went wrong, but also what America had to learn the hard way. When the United States began to grow, its leaders faced new challenges: expansion, conflict, and the looming shadow of slavery. These presidents pushed the country forward, but their biggest mistakes also pushed it closer to crisis. Take James Monroe, the president best known for the Monroe Doctrine, the bold message that Europe should stay out of the Americas. That move defined U.S. foreign policy for generations. But at home, Monroe's mistake was far more dangerous. He overlooked the deepening divide over slavery. During his presidency, the Missouri Compromise tried to balance slave states and free states, but it was only a bandage on a wound that was spreading. Monroe celebrated unity, even calling his era the era of good feelings. Yet the truth was clear. The slavery issue was growing too large to ignore. His failure to confront it head-on left the problem for future presidents, who paid the price in blood. Then came Andrew Jackson, a man loved by his supporters but feared and hated by many others. He was a war hero and a symbol of the common man, but his biggest mistake was brutal: the Indian Removal Act. Jackson forced Native American tribes off their ancestral lands, leading to the Trail of Tears, where thousands died during forced marches westward. He believed it was necessary for expansion, but in reality, it was a cruel policy of displacement that left scars on American history. Jackson's decision may have helped settlers move west, but it destroyed Native communities and darkened his legacy forever. Next, the country entered an even more fragile period. By the time James Buchanan took office, the issue of slavery had exploded. Southern states were threatening to leave the Union, and the nation was on the edge of collapse. Buchanan's greatest mistake was his inaction. He believed the Constitution gave him no power to stop states from seceding. So when the South began to break away, he stood by. Instead of acting with strength, he froze. Historians often rank him among the worst presidents because his failure to act gave momentum to the Confederacy and left Abraham Lincoln with a nation already falling apart. Buchanan's silence in the face of crisis was not just a mistake. It was a disaster that made the Civil War almost inevitable. This era shows how presidential mistakes can come in very different forms. Monroe's was silence on a moral issue. Jackson's was action without compassion. Buchanan's was paralysis when the nation needed bold leadership. Together, these errors created a chain of events that pulled America toward its darkest hour. And when the Civil War came, the mistakes of presidents mattered more than ever. Some tried to rebuild, others tore down progress, and all of them struggled with what freedom really meant. The stakes were no longer about laws or policies alone. They were about the soul of the nation itself. The Civil War and its aftermath tested American leadership like never before. Presidents during this period weren't just managing politics. They were holding together a nation torn in two. But even in this defining era, mistakes left marks that shaped the country for generations. Let's start with Abraham Lincoln. He is remembered as the great emancipator, the man who saved the Union and ended slavery. But even Lincoln had missteps. His biggest came in the final chapter of his life, his plan for Reconstruction. Lincoln wanted a gentle, forgiving approach to bring the South back into the Union quickly. He thought reconciliation would heal wounds. The problem? His plan was vague and far too lenient. By failing to outline a strong framework, he left the door open for confusion, conflict, and exploitation after his death. While Lincoln's assassination cut his vision short, the softness of his early Reconstruction ideas showed a blind spot. Sometimes mercy without structure can create chaos. After Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson stepped in, and his mistakes almost erased the progress Lincoln had fought for. Johnson believed in quickly restoring the Southern states, but he resisted granting full rights to freed slaves. He vetoed civil rights laws and opposed the 14th Amendment, which promised equal protection. His stubbornness placed him at war with Congress. Instead of helping unify the country, Johnson empowered former Confederates and allowed Southern states to pass black codes, harsh laws that restricted the freedoms of newly freed people. His refusal to protect civil rights turned Reconstruction into a struggle that would last for decades. Then came Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War hero who carried the Union to victory. People trusted him to lead as bravely in peace as he had in war. But Grant's biggest mistake wasn't about ideals. It was about people. He trusted the wrong men. His presidency was riddled with corruption scandals, from the whiskey ring to the credit mobilier scandal. While Grant himself wasn't corrupt, his loyalty to dishonest advisors damaged his credibility. At the same time, he struggled to fully enforce Reconstruction policies, and progress for Black Americans was constantly under attack. Grant's failure to control corruption weakened the government's moral authority at a moment when strong leadership was desperately needed. This era shows us the painful reality of leadership in crisis. Lincoln's compassion, Johnson's resistance, and Grant's misplaced trust each shaped how America healed or failed to heal after the Civil War. The lesson here is clear. Even when leaders win wars or champion great causes, their mistakes in the aftermath can be just as defining as their victories. Rebuilding a broken nation was never going to be easy, but these presidents remind us how fragile progress can be when mistakes go unchecked. And as the country moved into the Gilded Age, new challenges arose. Rapid growth, industrial power, and corruption at levels the nation had never seen before. After the Civil War, America entered a period of rapid change. Railroads stretched across the country. Cities grew at lightning speed. Industry and money began to dominate politics. But behind all this progress, the mistakes of presidents during the Gilded Age and early 1900s often made the struggles of ordinary Americans worse. We begin with Rutherford B. Hayes. He came to power through the disputed election of 1876, often called the stolen election. To secure the presidency, Hayes agreed to the Compromise of 1877. At first, this deal looked like a solution to political chaos. But his biggest mistake was what that compromise meant. It ended Reconstruction by pulling federal troops out of the South. Without protection, African Americans were left vulnerable. Violence rose, rights were stripped away, and Jim Crow laws soon spread. Hayes may have brought temporary peace to politics, but his decision abandoned millions to generations of injustice. Next came Woodrow Wilson, decades later, a man who led the nation through World War I. He is remembered for his vision of the League of Nations, a global effort for peace. But Wilson's mistake was twofold. At home, he allowed racial segregation to spread through federal offices, undoing decades of progress. And during the war, he signed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, punishing anyone who spoke out against the government. These laws silenced critics and put thousands in jail simply for dissenting. The president who dreamed of peace abroad restricted freedom at home. That contradiction darkened his legacy. Between Hayes and Wilson, others carried their share of errors, but it was Herbert Hoover who faced the greatest test before World War II. When the stock market crashed in 1929, America fell into the Great Depression. Millions lost their jobs, banks failed, and families went hungry. Hoover's mistake was not his lack of concern. He truly wanted to help, but his stubborn belief in limited government. He refused to provide direct aid to suffering Americans, insisting that charities and local communities could handle the crisis. He feared government action would make people dependent. But as the economy spiraled downward, his inaction deepened despair. By the time Hoover tried larger programs, it was too late. His failure to act boldly turned a crisis into a catastrophe. From Hayes's compromise, to Wilson's repression, to Hoover's hesitation, we see a pattern. Mistakes in leadership often come from short-sighted choices. Hayes sought political peace, but ignored human rights. Wilson dreamed of world peace, but betrayed freedom at home. Hoover clung to old beliefs while the country begged for new solutions. This period shows us that progress is fragile when leaders cannot see beyond their own fears or ideals. And as the nation moved into the modern 20th century, new challenges, world wars, nuclear weapons, and global power would test presidents in even more dramatic ways. The 20th century thrust America onto the world stage as a global superpower. Presidents weren't just national leaders anymore. Their choices shook the entire world. But with greater power came even greater mistakes, ones that still echo through history. We begin with Franklin D. Roosevelt, the only president elected 4 times, the leader who guided the nation through the Great Depression and World War II. His programs, known as the New Deal, reshaped the American economy. Yet his biggest mistake came during the war, the internment of Japanese Americans. In 1942, fearing disloyalty, Roosevelt approved the forced relocation of over 100,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them American citizens. Families were uprooted, businesses lost, lives shattered. What was meant as a wartime precaution is now remembered as a violation of civil rights. Even great leaders, acting in fear, can compromise the values they vowed to protect. Next came Harry Truman, who took office after Roosevelt's death in 1945. Truman made one of the most controversial decisions in history, the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. He believed dropping the bombs would end the war quickly and save lives. While it did bring Japan's surrender, it also killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and opened the nuclear age, a shadow that still hangs over humanity. Beyond that, Truman's handling of the Cold War hardened the split between East and West, locking the world into decades of fear. His mistake wasn't just the bomb itself, but the way it set the stage for an arms race that threatened the world's survival. Then came Lyndon B. Johnson, a master of politics who passed landmark civil rights laws and declared a war on poverty. But his greatest mistake was his escalation of the Vietnam War. Johnson believed that pulling out would make America look weak, so he kept sending troops year after year. The result? A long, bloody conflict that cost tens of thousands of American lives, divided the nation, and destroyed trust in government. His domestic achievements were overshadowed by a war that seemed endless and unwinnable. Richard Nixon followed, and his error is infamous. Watergate. Caught covering up a break-in tide to his re-election campaign, Nixon lied to the American people and tried to obstruct justice. The scandal forced him to resign, the only U.S. president ever to do so. His mistake wasn't just the crime, it was the betrayal of trust. Watergate proved that corruption at the highest level can shatter public faith in democracy itself. The next decade brought Jimmy Carter, who entered office promising honesty and morality. But his presidency was rocked by the Iran hostage crisis, when militants stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took Americans hostage. Carter seemed powerless to free them. A failed rescue mission only made things worse. His mistake wasn't his compassion, it was his inability to project strength in a crisis. To many, his leadership looked weak, and his presidency never recovered. Finally, we reach Ronald Reagan, the charismatic leader who inspired millions with his vision of a shining city on a hill. But Reagan's greatest mistake was the Iran-Contra affair. His administration secretly sold arms to Iran, despite an arms embargo, and used the money to fund rebels in Nicaragua. When the scheme was exposed, it shocked the nation. Reagan claimed he didn't know the details, but the damage was done. The scandal raised serious questions about honesty, accountability, and the limits of presidential power. From Roosevelt to Reagan, these mistakes remind us that even powerful leaders, commanding armies and shaping the world, can make choices that backfire. Whether it was fear, pride, or secrecy, their errors left deep marks on history. As the Cold War ended and the 21st century began, American presidents faced new challenges: global conflicts, economic crises, and fast-moving changes at home. Their decisions carried consequences felt not just in the U.S., but across the entire world. And once again, each left behind a mistake that defined their time in office. We start with George H.W. Bush, who oversaw the fall of the Soviet Union and led a successful coalition in the Gulf War. But his biggest mistake was closer to home, breaking his famous campaign promise of no new taxes. At a time of growing deficits, Bush felt forced to compromise with Congress and raise taxes. The decision may have been economically responsible, but politically, it was a disaster. Many Americans felt betrayed. That broken promise haunted him and played a huge role in his loss to Bill Clinton in 1992. Bill Clinton brought prosperity during the 1990s, with strong economic growth and budget surpluses. Yet his presidency is overshadowed by scandal. His affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky and his attempts to cover it up led to impeachment. Clinton survived in office, but the scandal damaged trust in his leadership and embarrassed the nation. His mistake wasn't only the affair itself, it was his dishonesty, which turned a personal failing into a national crisis. Then came George W. Bush, who faced the September 11th attacks in 2001. In the aftermath, his decision to invade Iraq in 2003 became his most controversial mistake. Believing Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, Bush launched a war that dragged on for years. No such weapons were ever found. The conflict cost countless lives, destabilized the region, and drained U.S. resources. Bush's legacy became tied to a war many saw as unnecessary, a decision that reshaped American foreign policy for decades. Barack Obama entered office with hopes of change and won the Nobel Peace Prize early in his presidency. But his biggest mistake was tied to the Syrian civil war. After warning the Syrian government that using chemical weapons would cross a red line, he failed to act decisively when that line was crossed. Critics argued this weakened America's credibility abroad. While Obama achieved major successes at home, like the Affordable Care Act, the Syria conflict showed the risks of hesitation on the global stage. Donald Trump brought an untraditional style to the presidency, marked by strong support and fierce opposition. His most significant mistake was his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Critics point to his inconsistent messaging, downplaying of the virus at key moments, and conflicts with health experts. Supporters praised his efforts to speed up vaccine development, but the lack of clear national strategy left the country divided during a historic crisis. The pandemic became the defining shadow over his presidency. Finally, Joe Biden entered the White House promising stability and healing. But his biggest mistake so far has been the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. After 2 decades of war, Biden decided to pull U.S. troops out, but the speed and disorder of the exit shocked the world. Scenes of desperation at Kabul's airport, as Afghans clung to planes and scrambled to escape, became symbolic of poor planning. The withdrawal ended America's longest war, but it also raised questions about U.S. leadership and strategy. From broken promises to wars abroad, from scandals at home to crises of leadership, recent presidents remind us that mistakes don't just belong to the past. They're still unfolding in front of us, shaping the country we live in today. So what do all these mistakes tell us? From Washington to Biden, every president carried a burden that no one else could fully understand. Each man rose to power with vision and ambition, but every one of them stumbled. Sometimes the mistake was born of fear, sometimes pride, sometimes hesitation, and sometimes it was simply the failure to see consequences before it was too late. Think about it. Washington believed Americans could rise above political division, yet the country split into parties almost instantly. Buchanan froze when unity demanded action, leaving the Civil War at Lincoln's doorstep. Johnson, after Lincoln's death, let prejudice block the promise of freedom. Hoover, clinging to old ideas, deepened the pain of the Depression. Nixon chose secrecy over truth and destroyed public trust. Bush entered Iraq chasing weapons that were never there. Obama's red line faded into doubt. Trump faced a pandemic with confusion instead of clarity. Biden's withdrawal turned victory into chaos. These aren't just stories about presidents. They're lessons about leadership itself. A president's power is vast, but so is the cost of a wrong decision. And in every case, the people, ordinary Americans, paid the price. The lesson is not that leaders must be perfect. That's impossible. The lesson is that mistakes, when denied or ignored, grow larger than the victories that surround them. But here's the deeper truth. Mistakes also teach. Without them, the nation wouldn't have learned resilience. The failure of Reconstruction fueled future civil rights movements. The missteps of Vietnam reshaped how Americans question war. The pain of the Great Depression prepared the way for social safety nets. Each mistake left scars, but each scar carried a warning for the future. So the next time we look at presidents, maybe we shouldn't only measure them by their successes. Maybe we should ask, what did they get wrong, and what did the nation learn from it? Because history isn't just about triumphs. It's about failures that force growth. It's about leaders who remind us that even the highest office in the land is held by human beings with human flaws. And that's the real story of America, a country that rises, stumbles, and rises again. Not because its leaders are perfect, but because its people keep demanding better. So, after hearing about the biggest mistake of every U.S. president, what do you think is the most costly error in American history? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the conversation about mistakes isn't just about the past. It's about where we go next. If you found this deep dive into presidential mistakes eye-opening, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps more people discover this channel. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next history breakdown. And share this video with a friend who loves learning from the past. Together, we can keep uncovering the lessons history has for us today.